What is up, my friends, and how's it going? And welcome back to the final episode of the Roma Army Faction Guide series. This is the third of third episodes in which we will be covering the Marian / Imperial armies of the Roman faction. Of course, we had covered in the first two parts the Camillian as well as the Polybian armies respectively. However, in this part or this series episode of the series, we will be focusing on the Marian / Imperial, and for the purpose of the video I will be focusing primarily on the Marian. Keep in mind, when it comes to the Imperial, you pretty much have exactly the same units with a slightly better stat, so there's not that much of a fundamental change in the units and their roles on the battlefield. However, this video will be divided into 4 parts. The first part, of course, is going to cover the roster available to the Romans post the Marian reforms, of course. The second part will be my recommended army composition. Keep in mind that I am going for a historical build for the army composition, and in fact, in the case of the Marian Legion themselves, the historical build is the most efficient build, if you ask me. Versus the Camillian and the Polybian reforms. As you saw in the previous video, you did have a different composition when it came to optimal composition. However, in the case of Marian / Imperial Roman armies, the historical build is the optimal build, so they both coincide. Of course, in the third part, we will be testing out that recommended army composition against an adversary, and in the case of the Marian legions, we are going to be focusing on the most iconic enemy of the Romans during the times of the Marian reforms, and that is none other than the Averni, the Gallic faction that the Romans were up against. Of course, we cannot fight off against another typical Roman legionary, although we can do it. Because technically Roma in this time frame did fight a lot of civil wars, so it was a lot of Roman legion versus legion fighting. However, it'll not make much of sense to fight off against a similar Roman legion, because the AI is not going to be able to effectively micromanage as well as, of course, the human player, which is me in this regard. So we're going to fight for a more against a more different sort of adversary. And keep in mind that being the Averni faction that we are fighting off against, we are going to fight off against the exact same army composition that I recommended for the Averni in my faction guide series for the Averni, of course. And that is because I want to maintain that consistency. I'm not going to give them an inferior army, and of course I'm not going to give them a superior army. I'm basically going to build their army on very similar to what army composition I personally recommended for, of course, the Averni. That being said and done, after the third part is over, we are going to go for the fourth part, which was not included in the first and second episode of this series, which is basically going to cover my personal recommendations for the general skills and the army traditions for the Roman factions that best complement the Roman faction. However, without any further ado, let us hop right into the first part, where I will be covering the Roman Marian roster that is available to them. And considering that is, of course, the post-Marian reforms, we get access to new reform auxiliary units as part of the special system available to the Roman faction. Of course, these are Marian auxiliary troops, which kind of disables the pre-Marian auxiliary troops. So everything you learned about the auxilia in the first 2 episodes of the guide, you will kind of have to disregard it for this particular episode. That is because they are no longer relevant, they can no longer be hired. However, if you already have them within your armies, then you can pretty much decide to roll with them, but I see no point in doing so, since of course your post-Marian auxilia have much better stats. However, before we hop into part 1 of this guide, I have gone ahead and customized my custom battle, as you can see, so that we can just pretty much exclusively take a look at the entire Roman Marian roster available to you. And keep in mind that the auxilia units, they are pretty much countless. I mean, you have at least 4 or 5 different options, if not more, in every single kind of region that you have conquered as the Romans, which means you have maybe hundreds, if not 200s or 300s of different types of auxiliary units. So obviously covering them in a roster overview will be extremely impossible to do. In fact, I mean, it could be possible, but it might take like 10 hours to do so. So obviously I'm not going to be doing that. What I have done, however, is carefully gone through the entire auxilia roster available to the Roman faction by looking up at the website Divided Impera under the unit roster available to the Roman Marian auxilia, of course. And I have selected one of every kind or type of auxilia unit available to the Romans. So for example, if we are looking at cavalry, let's take a quick look. As you can see, the Gallic cavalry over here, the Gallic auxiliary cavalry, they are basically a spear shield cavalry hybrid with a precursor ammunition that they kind of can launch into a charge to kind of disrupt the enemy charge. This cavalry option has maybe 50 other different cavalry from different parts of the Roman Empire, of course, that have the exact same stats. So it's no point including all those 50 units over here and basically comparing all the units side by side, because they pretty much are the exact same template. But what this means is that in the campaign side of things, you do have limits to what kind of auxilia you can recruit. So there is a cap on each of these auxilia. Keep in mind, all of these auxilia come from the 4th class population, which is what makes them so extremely powerful in the grand campaign, of course, because you do not really care how much casualties they sustain during a battle. The main point of a battle is to ensure that your core Roman citizenry takes as less casualties as possible, so that you can keep your forward offensive momentum going and that you can keep conquering and replenishing your troops as quickly as possible when you are in foreign territory where there's not enough of your citizen population to replenish from. Of course, that being said, you can see there are many different other types of units, such as skirmisher units. Of course, they are, again, you have 50 different options available, but I have gone for just a single option, that is available to you based on the kind of niche that they fulfill. You can see we actually have 2 skirmisher units over here, as well as we have 2 different types of sword units. We have the Batavian heavy auxiliaries and we have the Aquitanian heavy auxiliaries. Now the reason I include both of these is because you have a template that fits with the Aquitanian heavy auxiliaries, but stat wise they are slightly inferior to the Batavian heavy auxiliaries, and so the Batavian heavy auxiliaries actually kind of fulfill a slightly different niche. So I've kind of included both of them, even when it comes to superior versus inferior type of stats as well. So we will be looking at that, and of course, without any further explanation, you can see I have included even the core Roman citizenry roster available to the faction. So that being said and explained, let us hop into the first part, which we will be covering the roster available to the Roman Marian armies. Alright, so welcome to the first part of this guide, and we are going to talk about the Roman roster available during the Marian reforms or post the Marian reforms. As you can see, I have arranged my army in that typical formation, but I have split up my army into 2 components. Over there, what I just highlighted is your core Roman citizenry options, and over here you have your auxiliary options available. Keep in mind, the auxiliary options, of course, that are available are not entirely represented over here, because as I explained previously, you do have a lot of duplicate kind of troops from different parts of your realm that can be included, but of course we can't cover them all because they pretty much have the same stats, so it's kind of redundant to cover them all. And what's more is that it's physically impossible to get them in, of course, the battle map, because you might have like 50 different types of swords units, and of course the maximum army size you can have is just 40 in a battle. So it kind of makes sense not to include them, because then you'd have to make a video for each and every single type of unit available, be it sword, spear, or whatever. So yeah, what we are going to do is we are going to cover the core Roman roster first, and of course we have arranged our formation in that typical formation with our general options up in the front, followed by melee infantry, followed by, we don't have spear or phalanx infantry, we just have missile infantry, and a single melee cavalry. Of course, as you can see, the Roman roster is fairly small, especially in the Marian reforms, but the main area where the Romans shine during the Marian reforms is, of course, they are auxiliary troops. As you can see, we have a lot of options. We have melee infantry, spear infantry, missile infantry, melee cavalry, and missile cavalry, although keep in mind that this missile cavalry is more of a hybrid sort of a missile cavalry in most cases. They're just simply melee cavalry with a precursor javelin that is kind of categorized as missile cavalry, with the exception of course one cavalry, but we'll get into that, more on that later. Of course, this might not seem like as big as of a roster in the case of some of the other factions that we covered, and that is because we haven't fully represented all of the auxiliary that the Romans have in mind, but I have included each and every single type of auxiliary based on their stats and their roles that they fulfill in the battle. So as explained earlier, for example, this unit of spear infantry over here would probably have another 50 to 100 different types of spear units under different names, each coming with their own campaign caps, of course. So you can't just entirely spam out this one unit, which is basically the Thracian auxiliary spearmen, but you can pretty much have other units from different areas of your empire that pretty much have the same stats exactly down to the T. So that being said, let us hop into, of course, the first group of the Roman core citizenry, which is our generals group. But before we do that, a quick mention is that the Roman Imperial as well as Marian auxiliaries are the exact same, in a way that the pre-Marian auxilia for both the Camillian and Roman Polybian armies are the exact same. So you pretty much have the same auxilia during the Roman Marian Imperial reforms, during the Roman Imperial reforms, with the exception that several of these units, especially the infantry units, like the melee units and the spear units and some archer units even, have a double man strength, kind of like the Roman first cohort, of course, or the Eagle cohort, where of course instead of a 200 men regiment you can get 400 men instead, which is absolutely insane. Of course, these units have a campaign cap of 1 in the entire campaign, so you can't really just spam, you know, armies of 4th class population, 400 men in a unit with extremely elite stats. However, let us quickly hop into the first unit. Keep in mind that I am rolling with Ezuru Alexander's HD mod, so you can see a lot of these units look absolutely fantastic and really quality over here. And big shout out to Ezuru Alexander for his Legendary Empires HD mod. You can find it in the Steam Workshop. For those of you still wondering where you can get it exactly, you can just hop onto my Let's Play Swebo series, take a look at the mod list in the description of any of the videos, and you will be able to find a link to the Steam or the Steam link to the submod, of course. However, let us begin with our general options. We do have 2 general options. I have included the Marian Praetorians. Now, historically, the Praetorians were more of a police force that were kind of taken out from the best fighting men of the Roman legions, of course, and technically they did not have much of a battlefield role except as acting as personal bodyguards to the emperor, and they would go with him on campaigns. However, in this case we have 2 units over here. We have the Marian Praetorians and we have the General of the Legions. In the case of the Marian Praetorians, since they are an infantry unit, I wouldn't really recommend them as a general on the field of battle. However, you can use these guys as governor generals, although I wouldn't really bother because they're not that amazing when it comes to, you know, defending a settlement. Actually, I'm being a bit too harsh. They have really good stats, guys. They have 13 melee attack, which is on the higher end when it comes to, you know, single-handed weapon entry. Of course, if you're talking about, you know, a two-handed forceman or an axeman, they're gonna have way more melee attack, but these guys have some of the highest melee attack when it comes to a sword shield combination. Of course, their melee defense is incredibly high. It's almost even comparable to some spear units, so these guys are absolutely monstrous. Overall weapon damage is 32, 4 of which is armor piercing, so one of the better sword entries in the game, a very special gladius entry in fact. And they have 38 armor, which is rather surprising. I would have kind of expected 41 armor, but 38 armor is nothing to scoff at either. They do have slower speed and they have a ton of Roman formations. They have defensive formation, which bumps up their armor by 15, making it from 38 to 53, which is absolutely insane. Apart from that, they have the Testudo, which is a very situational ability that you would like to use, especially when you're under heavy missile fire or during a siege, especially against wall settlements where you are protecting your approaches to the walls, of course. And you also have the Hollow Square that is actually really good at countering enemy cavalry charges. And of course preventing your unit from being flanked on multiple sides. Keep in mind, both of these general units come from that first class population, which is the patrician class, so you know they're not that going to be that easily replenishable, so you got to be very careful with how you use these guys. Next up we have the general of the legions. These guys are 100 men strong cavalry unit, pretty much average stats when it comes to cavalry. You know, they have that typical 9 melee attack, 15 melee defense as a spear shield cavalry, which is rather low compared to some of the other general cavalries you have available in the game. 38 armor is not much. The overall weapon damage is pretty decent with 31, with 5 of which being armor piercing damage. And of course, as they are an anti-cav cavalry, they have more bonus versus cav than they do against infantry. Their speed, especially considering their armor, is rather slow at a speed of 6. However, these are your only options available as a general unit. But when you do hit the Imperial Reform, you can still stick with the Legatus Legionis. However, you can go for another unit, which I haven't actually included here because it's actually an Imperial unit of cavalry, which is also 100 man strong, but they have significantly much better stats. They are known as the famous Equites Singularis, or the chosen Equites of the Roman army. They were basically kind of like Praetorian guards on horseback for the emperor, so they weren't really used by every single general on the field of battle. They were mostly used just by Roman emperors, and they were actually historically double the size of a regular Roman cavalry regiment, or ally as they call it. However, in the case of Divided Impera, for balance sakes, they have been kind of nerfed down to 100 men in the unit. They also come from that first class population, but they have superior stats, and you can pretty much recruit them in every single general as opposed to just the emperor in your campaign. So a little bit of plus and negative when it comes to that unit. Of course, I haven't showcased them over here, but the main thing is that they also have a very Romanesque kind of a look. However, in reality, they were actually famous for picking out from Germanic units, so they actually ended up looking very much like Germanic units with that iconic Roman face mask of the early Principate era, and of course the later Imperial era. And of course, I also believe that, considering that they are actually from the Belgic regions and the frontier regions of Rome, of the Roman Empire with Germania, they should also historically come with the Maripos horse entry. However, they do not come with that as far as the campaign is concerned, which kind of doesn't make sense from my perspective. I have tried to voice this, to have a 200 man strong cavalry unit. I mean, if the Antagonists have it, then why not the Romans? But of course, this would make the Romans too OP, because you can't actually in the game limit a general unit to simply one as a campaign cap, so you can pretty much have all of your generals roll with this. And I know a lot of people will actually abuse that, but from a roleplay perspective, I would absolutely have loved to see those changes applied to the Equites Singularis, so that I could roleplay as them as the general's bodyguard unit for only and only the Emperor of Rome, of course, and that too if you have managed to reform your government rank into an empire. This would really make the unit extremely powerful. A 200 man Maripos entry cavalry unit with amazing stats, kind of like the Nervii or the Averni Maripos cavalry, would be absolutely amazing. And of course, having that very Germanic look in the base game of Divided Impera, with their assets, they look less and less Germanic. They actually look more Romanoid or Romanesque rather, like these units over here. However, with that, let's hop on to the next section, in which we're going to talk about the melee infantry available to the Roman faction. And as most of you know, the Roman melee infantry, actually what, I'm just going to toggle on the skirmish mode so that you can actually see the units a bit more clearly. We basically have 4 options. The first 2 options actually come from your third class population, and that means that's extremely good and easy to replenish. The last 2 options come from your second class population or your plebes. So let's begin with the first option, which is your Marian volunteers, and these guys have pretty decent stats. I mean, 25 armor. They do come with all of those typical Roman abilities, a decent melee attack, decent melee defense. However, of course, you want to be rolling with the Marian legions. These guys are simply flat out better. They have 11 melee attack, which is really good, 16 melee defense, again very good, a little bit defensively oriented as a unit, of course. The overall weapon damage is actually 30, which hits that benchmark very nicely, but 4 of which is armor piercing, so they do have that better gladius entry as opposed to many of the other sword units in games. They also have a bonus versus infantry of +1, which kind of adds up to their overall weapon damage, bumping it up to 31, and of course bumping up their melee attack to 11, so long as they are fighting off against infantry. Of course, they have decent armor at 38, which can be bumped up to 53 if you go into defensive formation. Speed of 2, because these guys are heavy, or rather super heavy infantry. Let's take a look over here. They are heavy infantry, so a really good unit to have. These are the core bread and butter of the Roman armies during the Marian reforms, of course, the famous Roman Marian legionaries, as you can see. Of course, if you have a look at the Imperial versions of these units, they're going to be slightly heavily armored, slightly better stats, especially weapon entries and melee attack and defense perhaps, and most importantly, you can even see a visual difference, some of them wearing later Roman equipment, such as the famous Lorica segmentata, of course, which is your plated or segmented plated armor that's very famous in Roman movies. Of course, it's a bit overrepresented in Roman movies where every single soldier is wearing Lorica segmentata, but in reality the Romans wore basically 3 different types of equipment, which was basically the Lorica segmentata, the Lorica hamata, which is basically the chainmail, and of course they even wore I think the Lorica squamata it is called, which is basically scale mail. So they had all different types of equipment, and it's basically handed down to them, although a lot of the Roman equipment did come from the state, of course, during the Marian era. But it wasn't just provided to them as opposed to how it is in modern militaries. A lot of these Romans had to spend their initial salaries on acquiring these equipment, and they were kind of forced by law to acquire these equipment. So it's not like they had a choice. So basically they used their money to afford what they can, which was provided by the state. So next up, we have the Marian veteran legions. These guys are 200 men strong, and now these guys come from the second class population, and they are basically just veterans of the Roman Marian legionaries, but they have much better stats. They have 13 melee attack, 16 melee defense, so very comparable to the Marian Praetorians. They do have a better weapon entry at overall of 32 damage, 4 of which is armor piercing, so better gladius entry, just very similar stats to, of course, your Roman Praetorians, as you can see. In fact, exactly the same stats. So these guys are absolutely really good, but if you have to take my money's worth for it, I think the Roman legionaries are much better, because these guys are slightly better, don't get me wrong, but these guys come from third class population, which is absolutely phenomenal. Next up, of course, we have the famous first cohort of the Roman legions, of course, with that eagle standard, as you can see over there, with the aquifia, or correct me in the comment section, or the aquifella or something like that. Basically the guy who carries the Roman eagle, or the Roman standard, which was very prestigious. And over here you can start to see some of that Lorica squamata mixed in with the unit, which would typically be the case, because this is a little bit more expensive than, of course, Lorica's hamata. However, this unit has similar stats to both the legions as well as the veteran legions. They have the same weapon entry as the veteran legions. However, their attack is not as good, or their melee abilities are not as good as the veteran legions. That doesn't make sense. Previously, they had the exact same stats as the Roman Marian legions. They didn't even have the better weapon entry. However, I kind of notified the Divided Impera team, and they kind of fixed that. But what I did notice is that their melee attack and melee defense has not been upgraded to the veteran legions. And keep in mind that these guys are technically veteran legions. They are the best of the Roman legionaries that were recruited from the legion and placed in this prestigious first cohort, which is double strength, important to note, 400 men strong, also coming from that second class population. Next up, we have the only Roman skirmisher unit, which is the Marian legionary javelin men, or the Antisignani. And these guys, although they appear very lightly armored, their stats are pretty beastly. They have 25 armor. They are a spear skirmisher hybrid, so that's very interesting. They're going to be very useful against cavalry. However, they have a slow movement speed of 300. These guys are 175 man strong, and they come from that third class population, which is also really good. However, we will not be relying on these guys because we will have a lot of auxiliary troops to rely upon. Lastly, we have the cavalry, and in the cavalry we have 100 man strong first class population Roman, or second class population if I'm not mistaken. I think it is second class population Marian legionary cavalry. These guys have pretty good stats, pretty much the same stats as of course your general of the legion, with the only exception being that these guys actually have better armor than your general of the legion, which absolutely makes no sense, of course, but it is how it is. Would I recommend getting these guys in battle? Absolutely not, because Romans were not historically famed for their own citizen cavalry. Instead, they relied a lot upon auxiliary troops for cavalry, and speaking of auxiliary troops for cavalry, auxiliary options are much better than these options, especially considering that you have them from your population class foes. So that being said, we have covered the citizen part of the Roman Marian / Imperial armies. As far as units are concerned, the only units I would bother with is of course the general unit. For the general, you can switch for the Equites Singulares, which wasn't actually shown over here. However, it's pretty much an option between these two different types of cavalry units. And as far as melee units are concerned, you're going to stick to these three units. You're going to have of course that first cohort for that historicity, and you are going to rely a lot on your Marian legions or your Imperial legions, depending on which part of the campaign you're in. And then you can also, if you want, get some veteran legions. Although it's not entirely needed, you can pretty much roll with just simply Marian legions, but you can go ahead and get some veteran legions if you fancy. It's kind of a little bit more historical. Of course, there wasn't specifically a unit like this which was named veteran legions, but in the Roman armies they were known for having 10 cohorts, the first cohort of which was actually the first cohort, or the eagle cohort, which was double man sized. And then of course you had 9 other different cohorts. You had 4 over here, and you had 5 in the back that were half-sized cohorts, or rather regular sized cohorts if you consider the first cohort was actually double sized cohorts. And now out of these you pretty much had the first 4 cohorts that were there. With the first cohort usually consist of more experienced troops, and then of course the other 5 cohorts that were in the back were the less experienced units, which are kind of represented by these two different types of unit. However, with that, let us hop on to the Roman auxiliary, and this is the reason why I rate Rome as the #1 faction in the Grand Campaign, is because you get population class 4 units that are actually super elite. Now, if we take a look at the very first option, we are talking about our melee infantry. We have the Aquitanian heavy auxiliary. Once again, keep in mind that these guys have a lot of duplicates in the roster, so you can pretty much decide how you want to roll with that. Of course, they have very decent stats: 9 melee attack, 13 melee defense, armor of 38, overall weapon damage of 28, which of course 4 of which is armor piercing. So they also rely on that gladius, albeit it's not as good as of course your legionaries, but for a pop 4 unit, these guys are absolutely monstrous. So if we just go ahead and compare them to our legionaries, you can see that they have slightly lower melee attack, melee defense, slightly lower weapon damage, but apart from that they are very similar in terms of stats. And what's more is that they actually have the exact same abilities as most of your core Roman legions, with the exception of course they do not have that defensive testudo. Next up, we have another unit of sword melee infantry, and these guys are the Batavian heavy auxiliaries. So the famous Germanic Batavians that were famous for their revolt actually. But these guys are absolute monsters. I mean, they have 15 melee attacks, so they're a bit more offensively oriented as opposed to your typical legions. That have 11 melee attack, 15 melee defense. These guys kind of flip the script around. They have 15 melee attack, 12 melee defense, so a bit more offensively oriented. They have a decent weapon entry, overall weapon damage of 32, 2 of which is armor piercing, so it's not really a gladius entry, it's more of a Celtic longsword entry, but it is by far better than any of the other sword entries you have for the other sword units. And there are only 2 of these kind of auxiliary units. One is the Batavian heavy auxiliaries, the other, if I remember correctly, are the Dacian heavy auxiliaries. Both of these come with the exact same stats. 38 armor, of course, they can do everything that a Roman legion can do as far as formation is concerned. These guys are absolute beast, offensively oriented legionaries. Next up, we have the spear infantry, and in the spear infantry option, since we really don't have any spear infantry when it comes to the core Roman citizenry, we do have a lot of options available when it comes to the auxiliary troops. Of course, they should be typically 50 other duplicates, if not more, but in this case, we are looking at the Thracian auxiliary units. They have really good stats for a Pop 4 class unit: 8 melee attack, 19 melee defense, overall weapon damage 28, 4 of which is armor piercing, a decent bonus versus Cav and Elephant. They do have a lot of that formation. They have the defensive formation as well as the hollow square, which is really good against enemy cavalry and flanking maneuvers. 38 armor, which is really respectable. So once again, an infantry unit that is actually comparable to your core Roman legions. However, in this case, a slight stat differences owing to the fact that these are actually a spear shield unit. Next up, we have missile units, and when it comes to missile units, we just have 2 different types of missile units. We have archers, and of course we have our skirmisher units or javelin men. We don't really have options to Romanize slinger kind of units. They are more available to us during, of course, the pre-Marian auxiliary era, in which, of course, you saw in some of our previous videos, we did employ Balearic slingers, if I'm not mistaken. However, in the case of the Marian legions, we don't really have Balearics or slingers anymore. Rather, we rely mostly on archers and skirmishers. And in the skirmishers, we have our first option. These are the cohorts Cananefatium or Cananefatium. And now these guys are really good skirmisher unit. They're quite similar to our our Roman Marian legionary javelin men. I'm not going to butcher the name again, the Antesignani, alright. However, in the case of these skirmisher units, they're 175 men strong, coming from that 4th class population, 8 ammunition, which is really, really good. They have a decent missile damage as well, decent missile range, but what's important is that they actually have decent melee capabilities. So while the Antesignani is actually a spear skirmisher, these guys coming from that 4th class population are actually a sword type skirmisher. So if I quickly turn on that melee mode, you can see that they actually have a sword, which is a lower version of the gladius again. So once again, you have that overall weapon damage of 28, but 4 of which is armor piercing, so they're really, really good. Apart from that, they have even better speed than the Antesignani, and of course they have decent armor at 20, which is not too far behind the Antesignani, to be honest. Apart from that, you can even see that their melee attack and defense is actually comparable to, of course, your melee troops, purely dedicated melee troops such as the Aquitanian Heavy Auxiliary over here. They have 9 and 13 when it comes to the melee attack and defense respectively. Next up, we have another skirmisher unit, and the reason I, got 2 of these is because they are slightly different in terms of stats. So when we look at the stats, these guys have slightly lower melee capabilities. They only have 9 melee attack, which is pretty much the same, but their melee defense is slightly lower at 10. But the only main difference is that these guys have a better armor, so they are going to be a lot better, in my opinion, in a missile to missile confrontation. However, in a melee confrontation, then definitely these guys are going to be better, as 20 armor versus 30 armor is not that big of a difference, to be honest. Because armor isn't a flat value that is applied throughout the combat. It's actually an RNG, or a kind of random generated number, or number generated, or a proc, or a dice roll rather, that happens during a combat. So let's say an enemy unit lands a hit of, let's say, 20 damage, then this unit will roll a dice anywhere between 1 to 30 and whatever the value is will block out the damage that lands on this unit. So let's say the dice roll is 1, then out of the 20 damage landed, 1 of which will be negated, the rest 19 is applied to the unit, and this will slowly deplete from the health pool of the unit, which typically is around 70 to 80 health pool. So what ends up happening is that 19 of that 80 or 70 has been taken away, and that unit is just that much closer to being killed on the field of battle. However, if the dice roll is 30, then the entire damage value has been blocked. But of course, this is a chance-based thing, so pretty much on the same attack, this unit could roll a 20 and this unit could roll maybe a 1, so it really doesn't matter. Of course, the probability of rolling a 20 in the case of this unit is going to be higher if you know your math, because you just have a 1:20 chance to rolling a 20, as opposed to this unit, you have a 1:30 chance to rolling a 20. So it can be argued that even lower armor is, even almost as good as higher armor, because it's not a flat value once again. And in my humble opinion, armor is a very overrated, modifier. Alright, actually, sorry about that. My game kind of crashed because I was kind of, moving back and forth between two units. Kind of, put my game into overdrive and it crashed randomly. It happens very rarely, but it does happen. However, let's move on to the next unit. In the next unit, we have 175 man strong Damascus auxiliary archers. These guys are really good archers. They have 38 armor, which is absolutely insane for an archer unit. Their weapon or their melee capability is not so great. However, only 5 melee attack, 2 melee defense. So apart from skirmishing, these guys have no real purpose in the battle. However, you can tank out enemy missile fire because of that really high armor value, and they have really good speed of 4. Missile damage is pretty average for a missile unit, a range of 175, which is rather surprising because most Syrian archers in the game have a range of 185 if I'm not mistaken. So these guys have slightly inferior range to your other Syrian archers, but they have much more armor in comparison, so these guys are going to be absolutely crazy in a missile fight. Of course, you have a lot of options when it comes to these units. You have a typical type of units, mostly Syrian based archers are like this, with heavily armored. So they are historically, in the Roman army, there were a lot of Syrian archers, of course, so it kind of makes sense that you have a lot of Syrian archers. These particular Syrian archers come from the settlement of Damascus, which is not there in the game, surprisingly, considering that it was a very major settlement in the historical terms, of course. However, most of these different Syrian archers come from different settlements like Antioch and so forth. You have the Hamian Syrian archers. Those men are actually double-sized unit, much like the Roman first cohort, of course, and basically they have 350 men in the unit, which is absolutely insane, guys. Next up, we have the final skirmisher unit, and these guys are my favorite. They are the Cretan auxiliary archers. They are better than any of the Cretan archers available. They have 35 armor, not that much melee capabilities once again, but they have that incredible 9 shots per minute, as well as 18 missile damage, of which a lot of it, if I'm not mistaken, is coming armor piercing, 4 armor piercing, which is a lot for an archer unit. If we just compare the Damascus auxiliary archers, you can see that, of course, they only have 3 armor piercing. So these guys not only have more missile damage, but also more armor piercing damage. So these guys are absolutely insane. What's more is that they fire at a really fast rate of 9 shots per minute as opposed to 6 shots per minute. That's almost 30% or rather 50% faster than these guys. So they fire at least 1.5 times faster, which means they'll be dishing out a lot of damage a lot more quickly in comparison to, of course, your Damascus or your Syrian type archers. Next up, we have the melee cavalry options, and in the melee cavalry option, you technically have 4 melee cavalry options, but they are classified, these 4 over here are classified as a missile cavalry, since they do have that precursor javelin. But as the pure melee cavalry, you have these 2 options, which are mostly shock cavalry. And the first option, you have 100 men strong. These are your auxiliary Cappadocian lancers. These guys have a pretty high campaign cap, so you kind of can spam out these guys, and you do have other units that are similar to these guys as well, but they are purely shock type cavalry, very similar to the armies of Alexander with their Hellenic or Thessalian cavalry kind of tactics with a hammer and anvil in mind. Of course, their melee attack is reflective of that fact. They don't have a lot of melee defense. They have a really high charge bonus, so they're going to be really, really good on the charge. The weapon damage is heavily in favor of armor penetration damage. They have a bonus versus infantry, so they're more focused towards hammer and anvil rear charges against enemy infantry, but they're not going to be too good against enemy cavalry, as you normally know that enemy cavalry, it's best to fight them with a spear shield combination to kind of defend yourself as well as dish out a lot of damage. However, if you can manage to cycle charge enemy cavalry, then this cavalry can come out on top. However, in a prolonged fight, these guys are eventually going to lose against cavalry that is dedicated to being anti-cavalry. Apart from that, they have really good armor at 47. Keep in mind, all of these auxiliary units coming from that 4th class population as such are incredibly powerful, which is one of the reasons why I do not recommend going for your citizen legionary cavalry, because these guys don't have as good of stats, but and they also come from that 2nd class population. Meanwhile, these guys have kind of better stats and they come from the 4th class population. Would I really recommend using these guys in battle? It's very situational when it comes to this particular kind of cavalry, and that really depends on what faction you're up against. If you're up against a faction that's very let's say infantry focused and doesn't have too many good cavalry options, then you can go for this cavalry because it will be able to pack a punch, such as is in the case of several let's say Dacian factions or Thracian factions. They don't have really that good cavalry options as in comparison, of course, to their infantry options. So these guys will fare very nicely against those units, or like the Galatians, which actually have really horrible cavalry, as I covered in my faction army guide for the Galatians. Of course, these guys are going to be very good. However, if you're against more cavalry oriented armies or professional cavalry armies, especially horse archers, that missing shield is going to hurt a lot. And of course, against other cavalry like the Averni as well as the Nervii, which actually have Reme cavalry, then these guys are going to be having a slight advantage during the charge. However, very soon they will lose in a prolonged melee engagement. Next up, we have the Roman cataphracts, and the Roman cataphracts, now these guys look absolutely badass over here, fully cladded, very similar to the Parthian style cataphract unit. Of course, this is the Roman response to the Parthian and Sarmatian horsemen of the east. Of course, 100 men in the unit coming from that 4th class population. These guys have better stats, comparable of course to your Cappadocian lancers, but in every department they have slightly better stats in their melee attack, melee defense, weapon damage, and of course their armor as well. Their speed is slightly slower at 5 because they are a lot more heavily equipped. However, these units are not spammable in the campaign. You only have about 1 unit as a campaign cap, so you're not going to be able to roll out a lot of these units in an army. And even if you have them in an army, you can only ever have 1 in an army and 1 in a campaign, let alone an army. So why did I include these guys? Well, for reasons being is that they are slightly unique to your typical bread and butter shock cavalry available to the Roman auxilia. That being said, let us actually hop to the missile cavalry, and before we cover the first missile cavalry, we're going to cover the other 4 that are technically melee cavalry, but with a precursor javelin. The first of which we have is the Numidian auxiliary cavalry, and we're going to compare them side by side to the Gallic auxiliary cavalry. Now, both of these cavalry you can't really see because the way the animation works in the game, even if I toggle on the melee mode, they won't really bring up their melee weapons, but they are a spear shield cavalry, so they are really anti-cav cavalry. So how do you know it without the animation being able to present? Now, of course, I haven't overhauled the unit cards for the Roman faction, so it's very difficult to tell them apart from, let's say, sword shield cavalry. But you can make it out by the unit stats, of course. So you will see that they typically have more melee defense than melee attack, and of course they have their weapon damage is very much like a spear entry with 26 base damage and 5 armor piercing damage. What's more is that it's actually hidden over here, but these guys in the expanded tooltip will have a bonus versus cavalry as opposed to a bonus versus infantry. So it's very easy to identify over here. what these cavalry usually are, and they actually come with 4 precursor javelins, which is amazing. Now the reason I'm comparing them side by side is that they have almost the same stats. They are 100 men in the unit coming from that 4th class population. However, the Gallic auxiliary cavalry does have better melee capabilities, 9 and 15 melee attack and defense respectively, as opposed to 8 and 13. The weapon damage is pretty much the same. The charge is slightly more in the case of the Gallic auxiliary cavalry. The armor is exactly identical. However, where these guys kind of shine is that they have a speed of 8, so they're incredibly fast moving, and that is because they actually have the Numidian horse entry, whereas the Gallic cavalry doesn't have any horse entry, so they are stuck at a speed of 4. They do have 41 armor, which again makes their armor much better than your general's unit armor, so a really good unit to have. Next up, we have another 2 options which are very similar to the first 2 options. The only difference being over here is that both of these units are actually sword shield cavalry, so they're actually better off against infantry. Once again, if I toggle on that melee mode, you can't actually see their sword, as is the case with precursor, precursor missile cavalry, is that they always hold their missiles rather than showcasing their melee weapon, even if you toggle on that melee mode. However, both of these are sword shield cavalry, and we have the Asturian auxiliary cavalry as an example versus the Batavian auxiliary cavalry. Now the Batavian auxiliary cavalry, not really worth showcasing, but I want to showcase them. The reason being is that you can only get 1 in the entire campaign, much like of course the Roman cataphract unit. These guys are absolutely monstrous. The only real difference between these 2 is of course their stats. As you can see, the melee attack of the Asturian cavalry, of which you have many duplicates, is just 11 and 12 respectively. In the case of the Batavian auxiliary cavalry, it's 13 and 14, so these guys are much better. And the way you kind of tell that these guys are sword units is, once again, looking at their melee stats. You can tell that they have a lot more melee attack versus melee defense, of course. But what's more is the weapon damage is very obvious. This weapon damage is a giveaway. So you have 31 base damage and 3 armor piercing. In this case, you have even better, 32 and 3 armor piercing. So you can easily tell that this is actually a sword entry. Of course, they do come with that precursor javelin like the spear shield cavalry, of course. And apart from that, the other differences between these 2 types of cavalry is the movement speed. While the regular spammable Asturian auxiliary cavalry and its duplicates has a speed of 6, the Batavian cavalry actually has a speed of 7. What's more is that the Batavian cavalry actually has the Mariposa horse entry. So the Batavian cavalry are actually, the personal horse guards, the Equitae Singulares Augusti. These were the Equitae Singulares that's also available in the game as a general unit. In reality, they were actually just Batavian cavalry, as I mentioned earlier. They were drawn in from mostly Germanic tribes, and as you can see, they have that very cool Romanesque Germanic look with that very famous face mask, which is what has been included over here for this unit. So I really love this unit. It's a very unique unit, but being a sword shield cavalry kind of puts them at a slight disadvantage against enemy cavalry. They are of course going to be a lot better against enemy infantry units. The last kind of auxiliary unit that we have available to us post the Marian reforms are your horse archers. That's right, Romans even get access to horse archers via auxiliary. However, keep in mind, as a horse archer unit, this unit is not comparable to some of the more elite horse archers available to the nomadic factions, but also to bear in mind that these guys come from the 4th class population. That being said, no nomad has a 4th class population horse archer that is as good as these guys over here. Now these guys have pretty mediocre to low stats for a horse archer unit, only 16 melee missile damage, a range of 150, which is pretty typical for a horse archer unit. Meanwhile, the shots per minute is also 6, which is rather mediocre. They do have a decent melee attack and defense, and of course they have a sword entry, so these guys are going to be good against enemy infantry. Apart from that, the armor is where they really start to kind of lag behind in comparison to some of their nomadic counterparts that can boast of armors from 45 and above, all the way reaching up to even 55 or 59 armor, which is absolutely insane. And in a missile to missile confrontation, armor is very, very important, as it can be the deciding factor, of course, between 2 missile engagements. However, they do have a decent speed, a speed of 7, which is actually much faster than some of the heavier horse archers available to the nomadic as well as Parthian factions, of course. So these guys are not entirely bad. Would I actually recommend using them against other horse archer armies? No, not really. And the reason being is because these guys are not going to do as well against enemy horse archers that are going to be vastly superior to you. So where do you actually end up using these guys? You could use these guys against lightly armored armies if you'd like to, and you could actually, you know, harass the enemy, such as lightly armored. I kind of accidentally hit that over there, but you could kind of harass the enemy with that's lightly armored, like in Britannia or Germania. You know, basically kite them. You can build, if you want a historical way of going about it, you can pretty much build an entirely horse archer army and easily keep winning battles. And even if you take a little bit of casualty, it should be really easy to replenish in the end turn, because you pretty much your entire army is consisting of these pop 4 horse archers that you can pretty much keep, you know, the offensive movement keep going, and you know, you can keep sustaining that. However, my main go-to as a counter to, let's say, enemy horse archers are of course going to be your Numidian auxiliary cavalry, and of course you want to prioritize on getting a lot of spear infantry units as your auxiliary units. And the reason why I suggest these guys is because they actually have a speed of 8, which is the highest speed possible for any cavalry unit in the game. What's more is that they have a shield to protect against enemy missiles, so they're going to be able to catch up to a lot of enemy missile cavalries, especially if you have the royal stables and you've gotten that 3rd level of horse upgrade. These guys can go anywhere up to a speed of 12 even. I've seen that happen. And that is absolutely insane. For those of you who have watched my Let's Play Roman series, you will have noticed that I absolutely demolished Parthia by pretty much relying on these Numidian auxiliary cavalry to catch up to the Parthian horsemen. And once you catch up to them, then your infantry can slowly join the battle and deal with them, and it should be really easy. In fact, just to keep in mind, a 12 horse speed versus, let's say, a 6 horse speed heavy horse archer that the Parthians have, you are moving twice as fast as those units. So the difference really is kind of comparing, let's say, a skirmisher unit that has a speed of 4 versus a Numidian cavalry unit which has a speed of 8 that's chasing them down. So that's what the difference of 6 to 12 looks like. It almost makes the enemy cavalry look like infantry in their attempt to escape from you. However, that being said and done, we're done with the first part of the video. I know it did take a long time because we were covering the roster available to the Roman, Marian and Imperial Legionaries respectively, as well as their auxilia, all in one combined part. And with that, we are going to go ahead, end this section and move on to the second section, where I will give my personal army composition recommendations for the Roman Legion, of course keeping in mind as historical a ratio as possible. Alright, welcome to section 2 of the guide, and as you can see, I've set up my Averni or opponents with the same army composition that I actually had in my guide section, so I'm not really cheesing this. I'm giving them what I consider to be the best possible army composition, with some really expert units such as the late Gallic heavy cavalry, which is going to be a lot better than our own cavalry. Just take a look at those stats: 12 melee attack, 18 melee defense, so really good anti-cav cavalry. Bonus versus cavalry, of course, at 4. Good armor at 38 and a speed of 7. But what most important is that they actually have the Maripos horse entry. So these guys are some of the best cavalry in the entire Western European side of things. So it's going to be incredibly hard to face off against them. What's more is that I've also given them skirmisher cavalry, although typically I don't tend to see a lot of skirmisher cavalry in AI armies, but this only makes the fight against them a lot harder. Apart from that, I've given them a very good Gallic heavy spearmen that have the defensive formation, 300 men in the unit, 20 armor, and of course we have given them Gallic champions, which are a lot of the champion units that they can use. So I have gone for a very elite composition when it comes to this, so I'm not really skimping out on my opposition, of course. As far as the Romans are concerned, we can go ahead and load a setup that I've decided, of course, before I had launched this episode, and then I'm going to pretty much explain the composition, of course. So as you can see straight off the bat, you can see that pretty much a majority of my army is composed of auxiliary troops, but in reality this kind of splits up as a 50-50 ratio. So if we have to do the quick math, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units of 200 men, which kind of negate 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units of 200 men. This guy is 175, so we're still slightly ahead. Then you have this unit of 400 that kind of negates 1, 2, 3, possibly even 2 of this cavalry, because of course they are about 200 men, another like let's say 200 men over here, 200, 300 men, and meanwhile the general kind of counters 1 cavalry. So we're slightly in the positive when it comes to the number of auxiliary troops that we're relying on. The ratio that the Roman armies typically fought in was 50 to 50, and this is almost about there when it comes to manpower. When it comes to regiments, of course you have a lot more auxiliary regiments, but when it comes to the number of men fighting on the actual field of battle, it's almost 50 to 50 ratio. So let's very quickly explain the Roman army. Of course, unlike the Hellenic factions, the general did not fight on the prestigious right flank that the Hellenistic kings often, consider it to be, a virtue to kind of showcase their bravery, charging head on into a battle, leading from the front. The Romans were not cowards. They rather preferred on, utilizing their tactical genius by sitting behind and deciding how the battle goes on, and then engaging in the battle when things seemed dire. So we have 4 units of cavalry, and these are of course going to be auxiliary ally cavalry, and we are relying on our Gallic auxiliary cavalry. Keep in mind these guys are not going to be as good as of course our opponent's cavalry, because these guys have better stats, and not just that, they even have the Maripos horse entity. So but these guys are fairly good in that they have their precursor javelin, so that's the only advantage that they have as opposed to of course the Gallic heavy cavalry. But once they get into melee, then it's it's going to be a little bit hard to deal with this cavalry. And what's more is that these guys actually have a slow speed, so they're not going to be able to escape from this cavalry. So if you're in a really bad position, we have to kind of alleviate that situation rather than just try to escape from that situation, because that's going to be incredibly hard, and we're definitely going to be routed if we attempt to do so. I could have gone for Numidian cavalry, which is right over here. These guys are slightly faster. They do have that Numidian horse entity. However, their stats are way too inferior in comparison to the Gallic heavy late cavalry. Meanwhile, the Gallic auxiliary cavalry are comparable, almost comparable to, of course, the Gallic late heavy cavalry. Next up, we have 2 units of skirmishers. These are melee skirmishers, of course. They are also auxiliary troops, and we are supporting them with 2 units of Cretan auxiliary archers. Apart from that, we have our auxiliary infantrymen. We have 2 units of spear auxilia, and we have 2 of the Batavian heavy auxiliaries. These guys are absolutely amazing. They have a campaign cap of 6, so you can technically, if you're rolling with this composition, you can technically have them in 3 of your different legions, and they are really good. And of course, if you consider the Dacians, which have another campaign cap of 6, you can pretty much have another 3 legions, so that's a total of 6 of your legions. If you roll with about, let's say in Divided Empire you have 14 legions, then you pretty much have almost 50% of your army rolling with these very elite sword units that are very offensively oriented. Apart from that, we have our core of Roman cohorts. They are basically going to be 6 cohorts over here instead of 10, because we do not have these slots to keep recruiting 10 units and maintain the army ratios, of course. But we are going with 3 regular Roman Marian legions, and then behind them or ahead of them we're going to have 2 units of veteran legions, and of course the famous Marian first cohort, of course. Apart from that, we do have a Roman Scorpio. Now, historically speaking, the Romans really ever used field artillery in sieges and in defensive battles such as fortifications, where they had a lot of these siege equipments on the ramparts. In an open field battle, they did not really use scorpions or other field artillery, which I haven't really included here, like your catapults as well as your ballistae or your lithobolos, however you'd like to call it. However, they did kind of use this at very rare occasions, and a lot of players would like to use this a little bit more in their campaigns, and it's a pretty useful unit to have. You can of course replace this with a lithobolos or even a catapult or an onager. However, in the case of this battle, I'm going to go with the Scorpion because it's not ideally the best artillery I would like to have in a battle. However, I am kind of opposed to having a field artillery in the battle, so this is kind of like the middle ground where I have no artillery versus me going for the absolute best artillery available to the Roman factions. And I'm going for the middle ground where I'm selecting a slightly inferior kind of an artillery, of course. But these guys have 12 men in the unit as opposed to, of course, the 6 that's available to your lithobolos as well as your, stone throwers or onagers or catapults. So yeah, I guess that's pretty much the army composition for the Romans, and without any further ado, it is also the optimal army composition. Apart from it just being purely historical, it's also the optimal army composition because pretty much 50% of your army, if not more number of units, are actually coming from that 4th class population. Then you have 3 units coming from that 3rd class population. You only have 3 units coming from 2nd class population, and you have just a single unit coming from the 1st class population. So pretty much majority of your army. So if we just count here real quick, we can take 2 of these units, put them up here. We have 10 units, I believe. No, we have 12 units. 12 units that are actually auxiliary units. So that's pretty much 60% of the number of regiments coming from the auxilia. You have only 15% coming from 3rd class population, 15% coming from 2nd class, and of course just a measly 5% coming from the 1st class. So as you can see over here, in terms of the campaign, it's going to be very, very easy to replenish your armies. In fact, you can go for an entirely auxiliary army. If you're trying to min-max things, like I explained in the previous section, you can go for an entire auxiliary army of horse archers that are pretty much pop 4, so you don't care if they take a little bit of casualties. They are definitely going to replenish in the end turn and continue their forward momentum, of course. But if you're playing historical and optimal, then you definitely want to go for this kind of army style. Of course, you could change a few things about this army depending on the kind of opposition you're up against. For example, if you're up against a lot of horse archers, which is the only real thing that you need to amend your formation a bit, you could get rid of the melee units and get in some more spear units. Apart from that, you could go for a little bit long-ranged archers that can kind of counter enemy horse archers, or you could go for these guys. You could, since they actually have a high missile damage, and you could get rid of some of your light auxiliaries, because even though these guys are really good against enemy cavalry, they're not going to be able to get into range of enemy horse archers, and even if they do, they're going to take a lot of damage if those horse archers decide to charge. Because keep in mind, a lot of these steppe nomads as well as the Parthian armies have horse archers that are actually a hybrid of lancer slash horse archer kind of cavalry. So if they decide to charge into these units, these guys are going to get absolutely devastated. If you still want to keep javelin units, then I would recommend going for the Antisignani, which are basically a skirmisher type unit. Although they are a little bit slow with a speed of 3, they do have a spear, so they're going to be a lot better in a melee engagement against enemy cavalry. And of course, you want to replace your Gallic auxiliary cavalry with, of course, fast moving Numidian cavalry that can pin down the enemy units and give enough time for your infantry units to catch up. Especially if you have 4 units of spear infantry, you can pretty much catch up the distance, and then it's your cavalry and the spear cavalry against their lancer slash horse archer hybrid, which is not going to be that good in a prolonged melee. And if they decide to run away, they're not going to run away with a unit that's twice as fast as them on the field of battle. Of course, you can even retain some of your Scorpios, or you can even slightly increase the number of Scorpios to deal with a nomadic horse archer kind of an army. And it's very, very, very much possible to deal with nomadic horse archer armies. And if you want to be absolutely certain, you can actually fight them in an open field battle and still come out on top. But the best ways to deal with them is if you are attacking them in a settlement and they don't sally out, or you attack them in a wall settlement, so you're pretty much taking away their advantage of maneuverability. Another good way of attacking them is actually to fight them in fortification. So as you move in their territory, you sacrifice half of your movement range, but ensure that you are going into a fortified stance every turn until you eventually catch up to the settlement and can besiege their settlement. What this allows you to do is it allows you to be within a fort, which kind of protects you from being charged. And what's more, there is an actual strategy that you can do against them in such a situation. That's really good, and I'll kind of showcase that in some of my other videos. Of course, this video is kind of long already and is going on for quite a while now, so we're not going to be showcasing 2 different types of battles, but fighting in a fortified position against a horse archer army is really, really strong if you know what you're doing against the enemy AI. I've actually fought as the Marians against enemy horse archers that were really, really elite guys, so they're not the typical levy no armor horse archers, and I've actually won decisively, and by decisively I mean to say that I've lost like under 300 men in my entire army. So it was just that decisive, guys. So it is possible, but I'm not going to be showcasing that in this episode. So without any further ado, let us hop into the third section of this episode, in which we will be testing out this army against a typical Averni, or a very elite Averni army. Of course, for the map I have selected the very famous Silva Carbonaria, although it's not technically the homeland of the Gallic faction. I do like this map because it is the absolute flat map. There are no real terrain advantages, so neither the attacker nor the defender can get terrain advantages. Apart from that, very little foliage, so you don't have a lot of missile cover, so it's really fair to both sides. And of course, we are going to be the aggressors. Meanwhile, the Gallic faction is going to be the defender. Alright, welcome to the battle. We have our Roman Legion, like, you know, just deployed in a default kind of a formation. Of course, we're going to go ahead and do that, but as you can see the battle map is pretty even on all sides, with a very little foliage over here, but nothing too significant. If I were to give my 2 cents on our army versus the enemy army, I would rather be fighting with the enemy army, as I have showcased in my Averni guide, because they are just superior in almost every single way. But the Roman formation with its maneuverability is going to win the day, and of course their discipline is going to win the day this time, and we're just going to have to see how decisive of a win we can actually secure here. That's really how I kind of test how good a formation or an army is, and not just how good they are and how many casualties they take, but what population classes took the most casualties and whether we will be able to replenish them in the end turn. So just keep that in mind when we are fighting as the Romans. Of course, you have to focus on your population class. And now, of course, as is the case with my army guides videos, I am going to be showcasing the battle in real time. I am not going to be putting up a replay, because I want you guys to see the kind of tactical decisions I make, the kind of strategy, the overall strategy I employ, and of course how I manage my micro and macro to kind of efficiently move my army around, and of course to set up my armies, which would not be possible to explain in a replay, of course. So the very first thing you want to do is, I typically like to put my cavalry on the wings first, but we do, in the case of the Romans, have a general cavalry that won't be involved in the fight unless he has to. So we're going to select him as a separate unit as group 1, because group 1 is the most easily accessible. Then we're going to select 2 units of cavalry, group them up as group 2. We're going to select 3 units of another 2 units of cavalry, group 3. So group 2 and group 3 are going to be on the opposite flanks. But before we do that, we're going to just select all of this cavalry, put it up to one side, hold down the control key and tap on the up arrow key to increase their formation width. There you have it. Then we're going to select all of our cavalry and toggle on that melee mode so that they can go into a charge. As these guys, although they are classified as a skirmisher cavalry, they are not. They are actually a melee cavalry, a spear shield cavalry, as discussed in part 1 of this episode. So we definitely want them to charge into a into combat, and of course just hurl their precursor javelins before they do that, in order to break the enemy cavalry charge. Next up, we're going to select all of our archer units and group them up, and I've kind of arranged them already, but if they aren't arranged in your campaign, what you want to do is you want to hold down the control key. So let's say I just shifted up over there, so now they're not arranged. What you want to do is hold down the control key and left click in chronological order. So I want my skirmishers on the flank and my archers in the center, so I have actually clicked them up again in that order. So while holding down the control key, the left skirmisher, the left skirmisher, an archer, and another left skirmisher. And if you click that, now you can see we have 2 skirmishers on the flanks, the left and the right, and the archers in the center. And we're going to group them up, and as you can see, once we group them up, they're also formed up in the group. Next up, we're going to take a Scorpion unit, put it up in group 5, and before we do anything else, we're actually going to arrange our infantry. So the very first thing I like to do is actually kind of try to match the width of my first cohort. As you can see, if I place them over here behind a regular cohort, they're slightly longer in width, and the only way to do this effectively is to hold down the control key, increase their formation width to the maximum, and then with the control key hit the down arrow key as well to decrease their formation width, and now they are perfect square. And as you can see, they are actually the exact same width, but they are double the depth of the unit, which kind of makes sense. Now that we have done that, what we are going to do is we're going to select all of these units, very similar to the Bolivian video. We're going to go into defensive formation, and now we are chronologically going to select. So what I like to do is actually put my auxiliary troops. Historically, these troops were used as reserves, but of course, as far as the campaign is concerned, I would like to use them, offensively. I don't mind them taking a lot of casualties. Although, of course, in reality, the Romans could have also used them in a more advanced position. It really depends. Nothing ever was as certain as it seems. There was not just one different style of fighting. Of course, the Romans had multiple different formations, and you can choose from what kind of formation you want to roll with. But for this video, of course, I'm going to go with the formation that I think to be the best. So we are going to select and form up into a triple S axis, which was still used during, of course, the Marian reform. So we're going to form up with our first line, which is going to be these 4 guys. Our second line is going to be our regular cohorts, and our third line is going to be our veteran and first cohort. So in order to do that, we want that checkerboard formation. So holding down the control key, chronologically click on each of the units, group them up, hit on the battlefield, and as you can see, they have been kind of arranged. So you can really tell by the shields that you have an auxiliary unit that actually uses the oval Turios kind of a shield versus the Roman scutum. As you can see, they are nice and alternate. Now after we do that, we just want to double click on all of these legionary units while holding down the control key so that they're all selected. Hit a grouping key and move them slightly behind. We can actually move them a little bit further behind. Next up, we want to do the same thing. So we're going to hold down the control key over here, and then select a veteran legion, an auxiliary first cohort, another auxiliary veteran legion again, and another auxiliary. Group them up again. As you can see, they are alternatively placed, and we are going to go in the same line as this flag and just click over there, and there you have it. Now these guys are almost exactly in front of the units, and now what we're going to do is select all of these units, once again holding down the control key, selecting them chronologically so that they maintain that same formation order. Hit the group key so that they are part of a new group, and we're going to move this group behind. So there you have it. You have a kind of a triple S axis. Now what I would like to do is I would actually like to select all of these units, go ahead, reduce the defensive formation width by 1, holding down the control and down arrow key, then control and up arrow key to again space them out, and then you can kind of get them out of the defensive formation, and now they have formed up into a nice block kind of a formation, a little bit of loose formation so that they can move a little bit quicker. So now finally what I'm going to do is select both of these first 2 lines of infantry and just move them up ahead of my missile units all the way in the front, and then we're going to just move our missile units behind them. We're going to take our Scorpion units, decrease the width. Now the reason why I do this is because Scorpion units, they cannot fire into each other. They have a clear arc and a line of sight, and they're not really big siege equipment, so they won't really hit each other, as opposed to using, of course, your Lithobolos and other, heavy siege infantry that can block the line of sight of the equipment that's behind them, that could potentially result in friendly fire. But in the case of the Scorpion, you can go for a bit more narrow formation, and the reason being is that Scorpion units actually take a long time, and any siege artillery or field artillery takes a long time to reorient. So let's say I'm attacking in this direction straight ahead, and now I want to change and attack in this direction. When they are a narrow block formation, turning around is going to be super easy. In fact, many of them will just turn around in their place and kind of reorient, so you're able to attack really quickly. However, if I am in that maximum formation width, if I give the as long as they're firing up ahead, that's fine. However, if I ask them to fire exactly at a 90 degree, then all of these units will try to turn around, and that can take a long time, especially with artillery units that have a very, very slow movement speed, because these guys have to actually push the equipment into position. So let's just go ahead, reduce that formation with control down arrow key, of course, and now our front line is almost formed up. The last thing we want to do is actually reduce the width of our missile units. I like to reduce it by 5 clicks down, and then we are just going to move up our final line of veteran legions a little bit up ahead. So now we have a kind of perfect formation. The last thing we want to do is move up our second line a little bit closer to, of course, our first line of infantry. And there you have it. You have a very nice formation over here of our legionaries, looking very, very good. We have some front line of auxiliary troops that will take a brunt of the damage. You have, you know, Marian legions that are in the back, and of course you have a lot of support troops in your veteran legions. You have missile units protecting and firing in from behind. You also have a scorpion unit that's going to be playing a very niche role in this battle, of course. And of course the last thing you need to do is actually don't forget about a cavalry. You want to arrange a cavalry, so we're going to put our general right in the back, as he typically was in the case of Roman armies. We're going to put our cavalry on the left and right wings respectively. And before we go ahead and start the battle, we are going to select all of our cavalry, control key, hit the down arrow key to reduce their width. I like to reduce it by 3 or 4, but in this case I'm going to go with 3 because I want a little bit wider frontage. And before we go ahead and start the battle, we're going to select all of our frontline units, which I consider to be frontline. You know, let's say that these two rows are actually your frontline units. This is your missile units, and these are your reserve units, so you have that triple line. But I want the front line as well as the missile units to be on guard mode so that they do not get out of position. And I don't really care about these guys because they're going to be predominantly focusing on maneuvers. So I want them to be a little bit more flexible in the field of battle. So we're going to select all of the first 2 rows and toggle on that guard mode so that they do not get out of formation. So that being said and done, we have gone ahead and we have arranged the entire Roman army in the formation that we like. You might say that this kind of significantly reduces our overall width of the formation, and that might seem like a disadvantage, but it is actually an advantage, because what ends up happening is if the enemy tries to flank, I have a lot of support troops. I have cavalry over here that can flank around. I even have a lot of reserve troops that can respond to the situation, counter flank the enemy, and actually deal a crucial blow to the enemy. So before I go ahead and start the battle, I am quickly going to explain what my idea is over here. I am going to form a contiguous front line with my legionaries supported by my auxiliary melee units. Meanwhile, on the flanks we have spear units on either flank. And what these spear units are going to do is that they're going to try to repel any flanking maneuvers and any flanking charges, and they actually have a very important hollow square ability that's really good against enemy cavalry charges as well as flanking infantry charges. However, it's a little bit weak in a head-to-head to melee, so we got to be very, very careful. If another infantry unit attacks us head-on while we're in this formation, then that's going to be pretty disastrous. What's more is that we can't really move as long as we are in this formation, so we have to be really, really careful about how we do that. However, without any further ado, let us control select the entire army, go ahead and start the battle and see how things go. So there we have it. We're just going to move our armies a little bit ahead because I'm holding down that space key just to get a line of sight of what's going on over here. I want to make sure that I am in range of the enemy horses, because of course, as far as it's concerned, the enemy cavalry is superior to my own cavalry, as I said it was. And I'm very quickly just reorienting my whole army over here, just trying to get into position really quickly. And my scorpions already started attacking some of the cavalry. We have dealt some damage to the cavalry unit. Let's spread it out a little bit. Now that we have put our entire army into formation, we're going to go ahead and enable that square formation, as you can tell. And we are going to just slightly withdraw our cavalry a little bit behind, not too far. We want the enemy cavalry to take the bait. Meanwhile, I'm noticing the left flank has a bit more cavalry, so I'm kind of focusing on that left flank. Hopefully we will be able to entice the enemy cavalry to attack over here. Let's just move this cavalry out a little bit, this one over here. What we are going to do is we are soon but surely going to charge over here, and we're starting to see some movement over there. Meanwhile, this unit of scorpion is almost done, so let's go ahead and charge. You can also charge over here. Charge this unit, please. Go ahead, charge everywhere, charge. That's perfect. We got a really good charge off, guys. And now we're going to use all of our missile units to attack over here. Meanwhile, this cavalry unit has kind of charged over there and they're already losing. Same, we're just going to keep hitting over here. Go ahead, hit over there. There's no more cavalry units over here, so it's might as well get out of that formation. Go ahead, toggle on the melee mode for all of the units. And what we want to do is just attack both of this cavalry over here. Meanwhile, we've gotten rid of almost all of the enemy cavalry, which is great news, but we're going to keep chasing them. The general has gotten into the fight, so we're going to readjust our Scorpion. And now it's time to kind of move out our melee units, because we can afford to do so. And as you can see, our Scorpions are actually firing very nicely around. And there you have it. Okay, we're going to go ahead, attack over here. Make sure we get rid of as many units as we possibly can. And okay, we want to move these guys, make sure that they do not get... Unfortunately, this unit is starting to lose decisively because, of course, they are being... attacked while they're in that square formation, so it's not looking too good for them. But we are slowly but surely maneuvering our forces around. We've gotten rid of that cavalry unit. It's time to go ahead and try to attack this unit as well, if we can catch up to them, that is. And over here we want to move our infantry as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, just go ahead, attack all of these units as quickly as possible. We are going to move our first cohort over here to respond to this unit very quickly. Okay, we got rid of that unit. It's time to get rid of the enemy missile units as quickly as possible. I know these units are being attacked by the Scorpions, so I'm not too concerned. Meanwhile, we're going to throw all of our javelins against this cavalry unit, try to get it out of the fight as quickly as possible. And since this unit is not completely routed out, we're going to go ahead and fight them over here. This cavalry unit is starting to lose a little bit decisively. Let's go ahead and actually fear it up a bit, so that it kind of, loses some morale. We have gotten rid of all of our melee or javelin precursor javelins over there with our veteran legion, so it's time to charge in. Of course, our units of spearmen are taking the most damage as is expected. We've gotten rid of that cavalry unit, so let's just get our cavalry out of there, get them into that position over here. Meanwhile, we're going to pull our cavalry back out. And we are going to try to, and this is perfect, this unit is retreating, so I can get out of square formation, move this unit behind. It has seen enough of battle. We don't really need to keep fighting it. What we're going to do is assign our archers or our Scorpions to attack over there. Meanwhile, these guys can throw into the unshielded side. These guys have almost used up all of their ammunition, so let's just go ahead. This unit is retreating, so we might as well just attack it over here. Go ahead, attack. Make sure that they cannot return back into the field of fight. Now, unfortunately, this spear unit is also losing a bit too decisively. However, we are going to rectify that. This unit is trying to run, so we're just going to keep any unit that tries to disengage, we're just going to keep the pressure up on them. And there you have it. Okay, so things are looking quite good over here. Unfortunately, the spear unit is looking a little bit too weak, but we are going to rectify that soon enough. Meanwhile, just pull out our cavalry, go ahead, charge over there. We don't want to get caught in by these guys. What we're going to do is just transfer our Scorpions over there. As soon as they kind of disengage, we have a little bit of a window to attack them with our Scorpions. So that is exactly what we're going to try to do. And as soon as they stop engaging, we're just going to turn off our melee mode against the Scorpions. This spear unit can kind of retreat a little bit because we are getting kind of supported over there. Go ahead, charge. Quick look at the entire battlefield. Things are looking quite good. Meanwhile, this general unit over here is trying to run. What we are going to try to do is perhaps assign our Scorpion to attack over there. We have a unit over here that can quickly just charge against this unit. Perfect. We have some cavalry over here, as you can see. Perfect. We're just going to stop our Scorpion, of course, from attacking. Just go ahead, charge over here, get a couple of these units out. We want to quickly as possible rout out all of these units. So let's go ahead, keep charging this one over here, get this cavalry back. Our first cohort's looking quite good. Get them into a new position. Go ahead and charge this male skirmisher unit. Reposition our troops, of course, move back. We have completely surrounded the Gallic army. We've taken quite a bit of losses, but not that much. Meanwhile, we're just going to go ahead, attack over here. We have another unit of skirmishers that are actually really, really good in combat. Let's go ahead now, start chasing as many units as we possibly can. We want to rout out as many units, of course, from the field of battle. But what we're going to do is let's very quickly just going to go ahead and keep attacking as many units as we possibly can. Go ahead, attack that one. That's the last remaining unit. Of course, we still have the general unit. He's winning decisively, which is really surprising considering that this is actually a spear unit, but it has taken quite a bit of casualties. Might be the only unit that's actually routed from the field of battle, but we are actually trying our absolute best to support him. the general actually kind of breaks with that, so we've kind of gotten a very decisive victory. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to continue the battle, try to rout out as many units as I possibly can, and pretty much with that we can end the campaign. Now this general is trying to run. Let's just assign a Scorpio to deal with him. Meanwhile, we have some units over here. Very quick look to see. We have a cavalry unit doing nothing over here, and this cavalry unit is going for that same unit, so you can actually redirect your focus. Meanwhile, this cavalry unit is doing nothing, so let's just go ahead, assign him over there. The Scorpio did manage to get a few kills off. For the most part, of course, our units are chasing down the enemy. We have fought very, very well in this battle, actually. Even though, as per what I said, I thought we would be slightly inferior. But for the most part, we have fought quite well in this battle. Now, the only disadvantage in this phase of the battle is, of course, we have very slow-moving cavalry. They're only a speed of 6. However, in your campaigns, with the Royal Stables and the horse upgrade, you can actually increase that speed by quite a significant amount. In case you need to see where the enemies are, just click on this faction logo, by the way. So it kind of highlights them for you, and you can very quickly have a look and see how many units are there in each, and you want each of them to be below 30 as much as possible so that you can wipe them out from the field of battle. So you can just keep spamming this. The only 30, that's 21 now. Meanwhile, these guys are 18, so they are pretty much done. What we're gonna do is just go ahead, charge this unit over here. Meanwhile, this unit, come all the way over here, charge this unit. These guys are 20 men strong, so nothing much. Go ahead, stop the firing over there. I don't know what you're firing at. There's nothing much left to fire against. The general's already out. What we're going to do is just leave that unit over there. We can fast forward now, and we're pretty much going to try our level best to go into this formation. Get a little bit faster, come on. I mean, they're going to be wiped out regardless, but I just want some better stats in the end game, you know, in the next battle analysis screen. So that's what we're trying to do. Just get as many kills as we possibly can, just to showcase how mighty the Roman army is. However, with that, we can go ahead, end the battle. We have won the battle quite decisively, and I will see you all in the end battle analysis screen. Alright, there you have it, the end battle analysis. As you can see, we have lost only 590 men. We managed to wipe out 3,700 men. This is almost 7 times, it's in fact more than 7 times our number. So we have actually fought a really, really good and decisive battle. Now, this might seem like a bit more losses as compared to, of course, the Seleucids and other places where I have actually lost fewer troops. I've lost less than 300 men, and you might think that this is a lot of losses, but just take a look at the losses, guys. Okay, we'll get to that in a bit, but before that, let's take a look at, of course, the Averni army. Slingers didn't do much. They actually did very little casualties. Our archers outperformed them. Even though we only have 2 long-range missile units, we performed better than their 4 long-range slingers, of course. Apart from that, the cavalry, which was actually superior to our own cavalry, underperformed. Our own cavalry outshined them. In fact, a single unit of a cavalry outperformed their entire cavalry. And as far as the army is concerned, almost every unit was wiped out. The only units that managed to escape were, of course, the fast-moving missile cavalry units, which I had absolutely no hope of catching. But that's fine. That's kind of expected. I wasn't going to go chase them down, even though I potentially could have. But for the most part, our cavalry did absolutely insane. I mean, just take a look at the casualties inflicted over here. We have approximately 350 for each of these units. Times that by 4, we have 1,400 kills from our auxiliary cavalry alone, which is about a third, slightly more than a third of the overall casualties inflicted. So your Roman allied cavalry is very, very powerful. Of course, our general did quite well, 197 kills. Our Scorpion did the job. Mainly we were focusing on not really masses of enemy. We're not trying to get as many kills as we possibly can with our Scorpion. We're just trying to level the playing fields as our Scorpion unit. We are trying our level best to ensure that we are taking out important units. Like you saw in that early phase of the battle, we were getting rid of some of the enemy cavalry, kind of slightly weakening them in order to allow our own cavalry to even the playing fields, because a lot of these cavalry, keep in mind, they are vastly superior to our own cavalry, so we had to kind of level the playing field before we engaged them. Now, apart from that, of course, our own skirmishers, especially our skirmisher tribe troops, they did absolutely quite well. They didn't see a lot of the melee engagement. They could have potentially racked up more kills if they got involved in the melee, but when it came to the melee, we were pretty much secured with our entire core of melee infantry. Of course, we had our front line, which consisted of auxiliary units on the flanks, and they did their job. They took the brunt of the casualties, but they held out against the enemy cavalry charge and flanking attempts. Of course, later on, when they were tasked with fighting against enemy melee units, they didn't fare so well. However, our Batavian auxiliaries did quite well. However, if you compare them to our Roman legionaries did absolutely amazing. And of course, our veteran legions and of course our first cohort did absolutely insanely well. 323 kills. This guy is pretty much the MVP. Now, the first cohort, don't get me wrong, I don't really like it in comparison to, of course, your veteran cohorts, and that's because for two reasons. One, as I explained earlier, the melee attack and defense is higher in your veteran cohort, so these guys can do a lot more damage a lot more quickly than your first cohort. Although recently I managed to convince the Divided Impera team to upgrade their weapon stats, they didn't upgrade the melee stats, and I might actually bring that up so that they bring these guys up to speed with the veteran cohort. What's more important is that these guys are actually 400 men in the unit, which means maneuvering them is going to take an incredibly long amount of time, as opposed to smaller units that are a lot easier and faster to move on the battlefield, even though on paper they have the exact same movement speed. So it actually took a while to get this first cohort into combat. And now another reason why I don't like to get the first cohort into combat is that they have 400 men in the unit, and they have a special ability that kind of rallies troop in case your general dies. And what that does is it actually paints a bullseye on them, which kind of focuses all of the missile infantry to focus fire on the single unit. So you'd actually end up losing about half to even more of this unit if they were a little bit in an advanced position and got into the fight earlier on. So what I typically like to do against enemy AI is to keep these guys in the reserve as opposed to being in the front, so that once I have kind of dealt or engage with the enemy missile units, that they're not free to fire against this unit, then I can perhaps maneuver around with these guys, which is what I did. So although these guys got just 300 kills, which is just shy of this veteran legion, keep in mind they almost had half the fighting time. So if they had almost the same amount of fighting time, they could have pretty much almost doubled the amount of kills that they got from the battle, of course. But that being said, let us just talk about what this means. Even though we took a little bit of casualties in comparison to some of our other videos, it is still a very decisive victory, very impressive victory, considering, in my opinion, the enemy army man for man is kind of superior, but of course our formation and tactics won the day for us. The significance of these casualties is that all of them come from the 4th class population, and a few of them come from your 3rd class population. So out of 500, if we just take a look over here, we can say about 50% of this cavalry, so that's 50 men, and we can add these two up, be a little bit more generous, say another 50 men, so we have 100 men lost over here. Meanwhile, as far as our missile troops, I'm just going to ignore that because I kind of overestimated over here, so we've lost 100 men in total as far as all of our cavalry and missile units are concerned. When it comes to our core infantry, we have lost about 100 troops with the combination of two of these units each, so that's 300. Almost 300 units, 300 to 400 men lost out of your 590. What that leaves is 190 casualties to account for. Of course, at the 109 casualties, you got about 100 men over here, I would say, plus another 100. So you have at least 200 men coming from so you have 300 men coming from your 4th class population, 200 men coming from your 3rd class population, mind you, which is really easy to replenish, by the way. And of course, you had just about, like, let's say 50, not even 50, like less than 50 casualties to your first and second class populations combined. So that's just how powerful this Roman army is. You might think that, yeah, on paper they don't have as good stats. The cavalry is good, but not as good as the Averni cavalry. But keep in mind, these guys are pop 2 and these guys are almost as good, and they're pop 4. Meanwhile, all the spear units, these are pop 2 units, these are population class 1 units. So just a comparison, what I have lost is just 300 4th class population units. I've just lost under 50 first class and second class population, as I explained. But if you just take a look at the Averni army, they have lost 200 plus 100, 500 population class 1. So that's already as much as the entire casualties I sustained. Apart from that, you have 300 times 6, that's 1800 population class 2, as well as 3 of the cavalry, that's another 300, that's 2100. So it's just like crazy. I mean, you can just see 3,200 casualties. Since I do minus the 500 first class population from this number, they have lost 300 to 3,200 second class population. Was absolutely insane, guys. You have no idea just how insane that is, to be able to fight a battle in this sense, because what this means in the grand scheme of things is that your capability to wage a war in the campaign is significantly superior in comparison to your adversaries, because you are going to be able to easily replenish. You don't have to worry about running out of population classes in your recruitment. Even if I lose this entire army, I don't lose that much in terms of population class. However, in the case of the Averni, a loss such as this can be devastating in their campaign. Not only have they lost that monetary value, they've lost all of that population class, which might be hard for them to recover from. However, that being said and done, let us conclude this series with the final part, which I will be covering my personal army composition, my personal army traditions, as well as general skills that I recommend for the Roman armies. Alright guys, welcome to part 4 of this video, which is going to be the final part of this entire 3-episode series, in which we will be covering my personal army traditions, as well as my personal recommendations for the general skills for the Roman faction. Of course, this is applicable regardless of the reform period of time in which you're in. And let us go ahead and begin with my personal general skills that I recommend. So the very first thing, as always, I would like to get the military logistician, so that I can gain access to the military conscriptor. That gives me that very important replenishment rate of 15%. Apart from that, I also will get an army upkeep cost of minus 15% for all land units, which is very, very important. Then apart from that, considering that you are the Roman faction, what you would like to do is you would like to go for the ferocious warrior. Definitely improve your infantry. Now, a very quick look to see our units over here. A lot of our units are levy tier, especially our hastati, perhaps even our Principes might be levy tier, so they actually benefit from the experience to our levy tier. Meanwhile, our veteran legions are no longer levy tier. Our auxiliary troops, they might actually be they're actually considered as auxiliary, so they don't really benefit from this. However, very quickly back to the general skills. If you go ahead and take the drill master, you will get a boost to your levy attacks, which is really, really good in the early part of the campaign, especially since a lot of your armies are going to be composed of hastati and Principes, so you will actually benefit quite significantly from the drill master. What's more is that you also get movement speed. Now, while the Romans have really good units in paper, a lot of heavy infantry, increasing that movement speed is really, really important. Apart from that, you can also get the experienced archers, which increases your missile damage as well as your shots per minute for all units, which I consider to be very, very powerful. And you can also improve your cavalry. So it's really up to you which way you want to go about these things. Lastly, you can also get the speed of all of the units. So let's just count and see how many things I can actually get. So I can get 3 abilities than just 2. So I am actually going to go ahead and do just that. So what we're going to do is go ahead and take the drill master, take the experienced archer. That will improve our archery as well as our skilled cavalrymen. A very typical build over here. We're going to go for the commander of men in order to unlock the booming voice, which actually gives more movement speed. And with that, of course, we have gotten a very good army over here. You can see our units move at speed 3 now, which is absolutely insane. And of course our own cavalry will be upgraded from speed 6 to speed 7, which is actually respectable. And once we get to royal stables, it might even bump that up to speed 8 or 9. So that is pretty much my personal recommendations for the general skills. Of course, you're gonna focus a lot on your melee attack and defense skill for your infantry units, and of course you can get the drill master. What this gives you is that important unit experience per turn, which kind of improves your unit fighting abilities as they gain more chevrons. And of course it does give you the movement speed for all of your units, which kind of stacks up with the booming voice movement speed that you get. And apart from that, in the early game it actually improves the melee attack and defense for your levy units. So if you take a look at, of course, our Hastati, they have a melee attack of 7, melee attack or melee defense of 18, but right now they have a melee attack of 9 and a melee defense of 23, which is absolutely insane. Because if we take a look at the Triarii, not even the Triarii has those stats, but because of course these are levy units, now they have much better stats, much better morale, much better speed, and they do have an additional precursor javelin, of course, so it's really good. Now finally, what I would like to do is also focus on the army traditions. For the army traditions, we want to get the Vanguard Legion. We're going to focus on the Garrison Auxilia, and then in the Garrison Auxilia we are basically going to select all 3 abilities. We're going to select the Frontier Garrison, we're going to select the Keepers of the Peace, and we are going to select the Defenders of Roma. Now what this actually does is that it unlocks subsequent skills. The first skill is of course the Provincial Guard, which you don't really want. It's only ever useful in the early game when most of your armies consisting of Hastati and Principes are levy units. However, in the later part of the game, you predominantly have non-levy units and a lot of auxilia, so you're going to completely ignore the upgrade to the Frontier Garrison. Instead, what you're going to go for is the Legio Roma Invicta. What this does is it gives you further upkeep cost reduction for all your land units and a further replenishment, which is absolutely powerful. And then we're going to go for the Auxiliary Defense Legion. Now what this does is that it actually improves the melee attack for all the auxiliary and area of recruitment units, as well as their melee defense. So let's just go ahead and upgrade all of these abilities to the maximum possible, and we can also improve the Garrison Auxilia that gives a melee defense for all infantry units and morale. So there you have it. That is exactly how we want things to be. If you take a look at the upkeep cost of this unit, it's 158. However, if we look at the upkeep cost right now, it's 73. So we are less than 50% of the upkeep cost, so that's just how powerful this combination is. Then what we want to do with the Vanguard Legion is we want to focus on the infantry, where we improve the infantry skills, and then we can also get the Indomitable Legions, which actually further improves heavy infantry. Since most of the Roman army consists of heavy infantry, is absolutely worth it. It improves both the melee attack and defense skill. Finally, we want to upgrade the Vanguard Legion to the maximum level for that further melee attack skill for all of your infantry units, and as soon as you can possibly get it, you want to go for the Veteran Legionaries. What this also does is that it improves your experience gain per turn for the units themselves, as well as gives a weapon damage for all heavy infantry units. So once again, heavily favoring a Roman styled playthrough. As you can see, when you say all heavy infantry units, this means literally every infantry unit that's heavy, such as melee infantry, spear infantry, phalanx infantry. It doesn't really matter. As long as they are heavy or super heavy or very heavy, they're going to benefit from this. Pretty much in the late game, all of your infantry units are heavy, including your auxiliary units. So about a good chunk of your army benefits from this, but the unit experience gain per turn at 15 in combination with, of course, your drill master, which is another 15, make sure that you can easily upgrade your units, gain chevrons as quickly as possible. Now just to compare these stats once again, we had 9 and 23 melee attack from the base of 7 and 18, but now after taking the army traditions, you can see we have 10 and 25, which is absolutely insane for this unit. But the heavier we go, we get even more advantage. Previously, the Principes as well as the Hastati had equal stats, but now since these guys are benefiting from being a heavy infantry, they're getting more melee defense, and what's more is that they're also getting a slight boost to their weapon damage, whereas the overall weapon damage of the Hastati was 26, 4 of which is armor piercing. Now you have with the Principe's overall weapon damage of 27, 4 of which is armor piercing. Finally, when it comes to the Triarii, you can see these guys are absolutely insane. Keep in mind, these are hoplite units, so while their stats might not seem equal to, of course, your Principes or your Hastati, the Triarii actually have that hoplite phalanx formation, which actually makes them incredibly tough. Apart from that, their overall weapon damage has been bumped up from 28, 4 of which was armor piercing, to 25. What's more is that they have insane speed. So as far as that's concerned, that's pretty much covers the entire army traditions and general skills that I would personally recommend for the Romans. Of course, you might wonder, why did I exactly get the Keepers of the Peace? I don't really have much of an option. I could, if you want to, you can ignore the Keepers of the Peace, but you could instead go for the Accomplished Skirmishers, which actually increases your movement speed for all of your light infantry. It increases your archers things, and honestly speaking, that's not a bad thing, because it would allow a lot of your archers to dish out a little bit more punishment. However, I do like the Frontier Garrison because it allows me with that campaign range movement, which is which is really important, especially in the late game. So this is one of the last things I would actually take. I would actually try my level best to get all of the other abilities and then finally take this one, or perhaps the Accomplished Skirmishers, depending on your choice. The reason being is the Accomplished Skirmishers is typically about 20% of your army, perhaps even less. In the case of my own personal army composition that I had showcased earlier in this video, it's about 20% of the army is benefiting from it. However, in the case of course, Frontier Garrison, the entire army is benefiting from that 9 campaign map movement range. And while it might not seem like the movement has been upgraded in this turn, and that's because it hasn't, you can actually see that some of that movement is actually being taken off over here, because that's basically going to be my new movement range in the next turn. This is my current movement range, and this is the new upgraded movement range. Apart from that, it also gives morale for all units in battles in own or allied territory, which is not that big of a deal, because mostly you're going to be fighting offensive battles, but it can be useful in certain niche situations, especially if you're fighting in your own allied territory. Let's say you're trying to get some sort of a momentum advantage, especially in the early game. If you've seen my Let's Play Roma series, I do not try to attack Paris, because of course I have even the Etruscans to deal with. Thankfully, with the submods that I'm using, which allows for all diplomatic options, I was able to pay off a lot of people to declare war against the Etruscans, which made them more likely to accept becoming a confederate with Roma, which stays as Roma as a confederate, and then focus my attention towards Pyrrhus. What I ended up doing is feigning weakness, so basically allowed Pyrrhus to come all the way up here and then reinforce Beneventum by staying over here. What that did is it made Pyrrhus rethink his his attack route and come all the way down here. And then what I did is I kind of moved over here. I just moved a little bit over here, made this weaker with a weak army, and kept a strong army protecting Beneventum. So Pyrrhus, he was waiting over here at Beneventum, and he could not attack because I had a strong army protecting the settlement. Meanwhile, I had a weak army over here, so Pyrrhus actually wasted a turn going all the way up to Beneventum because he thought it's weak. And that's just how the AI functions. If they spot a weakness, they'll try to attack it. So what you can actually do is purposely present them with weaknesses that they would try to exploit. So then what I did is, obviously with that weaker army that I sent down here, now that Pyrrhus is all the way up here, he decides it's no longer viable to attack Beneventum. He decides in the end turn to go ahead and attack this weaker army, which he could have easily crushed. But all I did in that time was to simply retreat my army further back. And now what ends up happening is Pyrrhus is kind of stuck in our own territory of Cosentia, and in the next turn I am free to attack Pyrrhus with the bigger army. And since it's an even fight as far as the auto-resolve bonus is concerned and as far as army strengths are concerned, Pyrrhus did not retreat and he managed to fight the battle in our own territory. And a lot of the times I actually end up doing this in my campaign. It's now part of a habit of what I do, is because fighting a battle in your own or allied territory has its advantages. The main advantage is you're able to defeat an enemy army and he's going to be stuck in hostile territory, so unable to replenish in the end turn. Meanwhile, your army, which took a little bit of casualties, like 590 casualties in the example of our battle that we fought in this episode, of course, we're going to be able to replenish that within the very next turn. So in the very next turn, we're going to have a full army ready to attack Pyrrhus's extremely weak army and then push on towards Taris with a full army. So what that's actually doing is it's allowing you to maintain your momentum. And I know I say this a lot: offensive, forward, pushing the momentum, it's all the same thing. Basically what you want to do is you want to maximize your replenishment, you want to minimize the enemy army. And when it comes to fighting wars, the main objective is not actually conquering settlement, guys. I cannot stress this enough. A lot of people focus on attacking settlements. What this does is actually leaves you vulnerable to counterattacks from enemy armies. The main objective of a war is to negate or completely crush an enemy army or incapacitate them, and as such then they cannot do anything. They cannot counterattack you, they cannot defend their settlements. So the main objective of a war is to defeat and crush your enemy armies, and then the conquest that follows and which you acquire settlements is just a byproduct of that mentality. So you want to focus on enemy armies, and then as a reward you get a settlement as a side reward. So that's pretty much what you want to do. As most of you have seen in my Suebos campaign fighting against Roma, basically what I was trying to do, I could go ahead, attack Roma head on, focus on that garrison, fight out a very tough battle, but instead I chose to attack the smaller army that was outside Roma, crush them entirely, crush the Roman garrison outside, and now taking over Roma was going to be super easy for me as the Suebos. I was easily able to capture the settlement. All they had left was a single half-man slinger unit for the garrison, so it was very easy to conquer Roma without much bloodshed. So yeah, that being said and done, of course, I'm done with the series. I'm really happy that you guys enjoyed the first 2 parts of the series. Hopefully you like this 3rd episode as well. And if you like the video, then don't forget to like the video, and don't forget to subscribe if you are interested for more. Peace and love.